Bienvenidos a todos o a todas. Why is the masculine the default for like all of these like romance languages? We should change that. I don't know. Maybe I'm just kidding. Anyways, today we are talking about the diminishing resources and deteriorating environmental conditions on our planet. This is going to be a part 3 in a little mini series. Today we're going to be focusing on farming, and this is going to be a smaller video to the much larger video focusing on the paper Global Warming, Climate Change, and Environmental Pollution, a recipe for a multifactorial stress combination disaster by the authors Sarah Zenelinas, Felix Versicci, and Ron Mittler. I know, I'm so sorry that I have mispronounced those names. Now, let's take a deeper look into how the majority of land is used here on Earth. In this figure, we can see exactly how Earth is divided, and as the name suggests, the blue planet, 71% of Earth's surface is considered ocean. This leaves everything else be considered land, which accounts for about 29% of Earth's surface. Of this 29%, 76% is suitable for human habitation and use. This is also known as hospitable land, which is probably the land that you're most familiar with and think of when you think of land on Earth. However, 24% of the land is not hospitable for humans, and it's covered in things such as glaciers, deserts, salt flats, etc. Now, I'm sure most of you think that since humans have such a large effect on the globe, we must take up most of the land for ourselves. And in some sense, that is true, but realistically, roughly 55% of all humans live in urban areas, which take up roughly 1% of all hospitable land. This little sliver, 55% of humans live here. This leaves the remaining 45% to be scattered across rural lands, where the land has low population and infrastructure densities relative to the area they occupy. You might wonder, why don't you see any rural land as a category on this chart? I see agriculture, forests, shrubs, urban land, and bodies of water, but no rural. That is because rural land is encompassed within agricultural land, as the primary use of rural land is inherently agriculture. Agriculture land encompasses all the land used for agricultural purposes. It's worth noting, depending on the classification material for urban land or how specific organizations categorize lands differently across the globe, land with medium densities, such as suburban lands, can either be considered rural land or urban land. The rest of this figure breaks down how specifically agricultural land is used. I just want to point out that 80% of the agricultural land is not directly used for humans. It's used for feed for animals and textiles. Also, I want to note that this data is based off a couple years ago, and the numbers have shifted today where urban land is between 2.5 and 3%. And these numbers shift because of human activity. Forests are less because of deforestation. Agricultural land is closer to 40%. However, the relative size to each one of these lands is still the same to one another, meaning hospitable land is still the largest percent. And these numbers are changing as global warming increases. It increases sea level rise, which causes this to decrease, all of which is due to human activity. With all that being said, let's take a look at figure 1C from the paper. Again, across time, as world population increases, arable land directly decreases, causing an inverse relationship. Arable land specifically refers to the land that is currently being capable of being plowed and includes all land under temporary standing. However, it does exclude any land that is in permanent use, such as land for fruit trees or permanent pastures, and it is part of agriculture. Because of this inverse relationship between world population getting bigger and less amount of arable land, it demands for an increase in efficiency in the remaining land that we have. Traditionally, in many regions around the globe, farming has predominantly relied on monocultural practices. This approach involves cultivating a single crop at a time on the same land. This has led to the attraction of several different species finding ways to survive, seeing as their native environments are continuously being lost. These species find resources in vast plots of land with a single crop. And to keep up with efficiency needs and address lowering crop yields due to these species, farming industries have increasingly relied on the use of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and genetically modifying their crops. However, it comes with lots of drawbacks. The farming industry uses chemical pesticides, which are a substance or mixture intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any quote-unquote pest. There are two main types of pesticides. One intended on targeting plants known as herbicides, and the other intended on targeting insects known as insecticides. Specifically, neonicotinoids are a class of insecticides that are neuroactive or brain active and has a similar chemical structure to nicotine. Down below here in this picture, it's showing several different ways neonicotinoids are affecting the environment. However, this can broadly be used to explain the effects of pesticides and herbicides on the environment as well. Because these chemicals are inherently water soluble by design, this leaves any substance on the surface to flow as runoff into bodies of water. Also, these chemicals can be released as dust coating seeds during planting. This dust can reach off-target sites and non-target invertebrates. Lots of times these chemicals are sprayed, and when they're sprayed, that has a chance of targeting and exposing non-target areas and invertebrates. When these chemicals are applied, and especially when they get into non-target areas, the plants then uptake them to different parts of the tissue and can be put into pollen or nectar or other tissues such as leaves, which other non-target or direct target insects then consume and affect the ecosystem. Again, since these chemicals are also inherently water soluble, the chemicals can leach into the soil. The leaching into the soil then can go into our groundwater system. These chemicals are also long lasting, so once they're sprayed, they're in the area affecting the environment for many months to a year after one spray, and most of the times they're sprayed multiple times. Similar to the dust, pesticides can drift in the wind and contaminate other non-target soils off into the distance. Also, when these chemicals are in the soils, they have a chance to target non-target habitats and creatures such as ground nesting bees to be contaminated and killed, and these bees and any non-target pollinators are crucial to the system at large. So it's important to think of how we can improve this system and rely less on chemical pesticides. As we can see, they have a whole host of problems in the environment. All of these contaminants eventually makes its way into our food supply, especially when they're contaminating water sources, or they're contaminating the foods that we directly eat, or indirectly through the environment. Now, just like all living things, plants needs a certain set of conditions for them to grow. For plants, the law of the minimum states that plant growth is dependent on the least abundant resource available, even if all other resources are in abundance. And in this little tiny illustration here, we can see that if yield is the same as the amount of water this bucket can hold, and the sides or the walls of the bucket are things that the plant needs, such as sunlight, magnesium, water, etc., then the maximum amount of yield or water that a plant can produce is dependent on the lowest wall. And it's important to note the lowest wall, or the lowest abundant resource, one day or 1 week might be the most abundant, or just a middle wall another day or another week, and these conditions are constantly changing. Also, the longer a single plant is cultivated in the same specific area, more of the same resources are extracted from that specific environment. And the less those resources are replenished naturally back into the soil and overall the environment. This is why you might see some fields change their crops every few years and or leave the land untouched every so often. It's all an effort to replenish the resources lost. Due to this and increasing efficiency demands, the farming industry supplements these plants with fertilizers or plant food, which specifically dissolves in water and sprayed over plants, similar to the pesticides. However, a more natural way to vastly reduce the use of pesticides and fertilizers and naturally increase efficiency is through polyculture farming. Polyculture farming is the practice of cultivating multiple crops within the same space. This vastly reduces the need for pesticides and fertilizers. This is also the same advanced farming practice that Native Americans used before colonists thought them as lesser and cleared them out along with their farms to set up monoculture farming instead. And in this figure here is a simple example on how polyculture farms work. Put simply, these target plants are surrounded by different groups of plants that all help it in some sort of way. You have haven plants, which support natural pollinators, predators, and parasitoids. Trap crops that attract pests away from the target crop. You have screening crops, which stops pests from directly seeing the target crop. And you also have aromatic companion crops that deter pests from seeing the crop through odors rather than a physical barrier. And then you also have groups of plants that help bring nutrients back into the soil. For example, legumes, which are known to be part of the pea or bean family and can fix nitrogen into a usable form from the air and add that into the soil, acting as a natural fertilizer. And up in here are all the different types of legumes you might see or are familiar with. On the bottom right here is a small example of how this system can be used. And I'm not going to go into specifics of all of these plants. Please feel free to pause the video to see all of them. But for example, dandelions attract pollinators. Onions are a pest deterrent. Clovers, again, are fixing nitrogen. And rhubarb is a natural weed suppressant. The system can also be expanded to have multiple different target groups, creating a whole web of plants. And when compared to monoculture farming, polyculture farming increases nutrient efficiency, water efficiency, biodiversity, and soil functional microorganisms. And it also decreases soil-borne diseases and soil erosion. One of the biggest drawbacks that you might hear from fertilizer and farming adjacent companies is that this farming is not able to be grown at scale. But we humans already have done this before, and we can certainly do it again and potentially even better. We just have to listen to science and have the environment's health first on every decision instead of money. Speaking of which, agricultural productivity is a ratio measured by the amount of yield of product per unit of agricultural input. In figure 1F of the paper, we can see the projected change of agricultural productivity within specific regions across the globe, comparing the years of 2080 to 2003, where the darker the red the color, the less productive it is, and the darker the green the color, the more productive it is. Areas right here, and between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, areas are going to become less productive. In the areas outside of that, so down here in the southern part of South America and Australia, New Zealand here, and then northern parts of Central and North Asia, basically all of Europe, and the northern parts of North America, are we going to become more productive? This is because of climate change, which is the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. Today, this process is driven by global warming via human activity. This is causing all climates to become hotter in general. In a very specific case, this figure is showing the areas where wine grapes are currently being grown and how they will shift in the coming years. Areas in red are currently areas suitable for wine grape production. However, by 2050, they're going to be lost. Areas in blue will be the new areas suitable for wine grape starting in 2050. And then areas in green will be areas suitable for wine production through 2050. And as you can see, in the general sense, this area, all this wine production is going to move more north, as this area is typically known for its colder regions. It's now becoming warmer, so it's going to become more suitable, and this area was typically suitable is going to become too hot. This will directly affect the total market value of goods and services of a country, also known as the gross domestic product, or the GDP of a country. Currently, wine industry accounts for roughly 1.9% and 1.1% for Spain and Italy, respectively. Because of climate change, wine will no longer come from those countries which are known for wine, Spain, Italy, France, and instead we're going to get wine from Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands, Czechia, Poland, parts of Britain, Denmark, and even Sweden. It does seem that wine production in France overall and in general are going to hold. However, in the local economies, southern France is going to get hit the hardest as they're going to lose wine production, but northern France is going to be able to support the loss from southern France. But this is how, among many other factors, climate change is going to affect the GDP and the economies of countries. That's all for this section. I hope you guys enjoyed and you guys learned something interesting. Please let me know what was your favorite part. I want you to guys know that I love you and that this is a safe space. And with that, here are my sources.